Thank you, Mom. We'll be all right. In the pre-dawn hours of Minnesota, a soft light spilled from the windows of a two-story house nestled in a residential neighborhood. In the kitchen, Carol Blake was busy preparing breakfast. Her shoulder-length brown hair tied back neatly, the way she adjusted her apron reflected her characteristically meticulous nature. "Katie, time to wake up." Her gentle green eyes checked the clock. 6 a.m. The start of her unchanging daily routine. As the manager of Sunshine Care Daycare Center, Carol's day started early. But even more important was her morning time with 8-year-old Katie. Making her daughter's lunch with love was like a ritual she never skimped on since losing her own mother 19 years ago. "Good morning, Mama." Katie, coming down the stairs, was a striking young girl with her mother's green eyes and golden twin tails. A third grader at Greenwood Elementary School, she was an excellent student highly trusted by her teacher, Mrs. Johnson. However, she'd had asthma since she was little, which was Carol's constant concern. "The weather forecast says it'll be windy today. Don't forget your asthma medication." Katie nodded with familiar ease at her mother's worried tone. Her mother's excessive worry was just part of her daily life. Carol never failed in her daily habit of checking the house's security. Verifying the security cameras were working, checking windows that served as emergency exits, confirming the escape ladder's condition. The traumatic memory of losing her mother Ellen to fire 20 years ago compelled her to do so. It happened in Columbus, Ohio, in 2004. Her stepfather's arson for insurance money. Her mother, asleep at the time, couldn't escape and lost her life. That experience drastically changed Carol's life. She was cautious about marriage too, until she met Mark at a charity event 8 years ago. Mark Blake, a site supervisor at Connect Construction. She was drawn to his short black hair, sturdy build, and sincere personality, deciding to marry after 2 years of dating. But lately, he seemed different. A new expensive watch, increasing over time, never letting go of his phone. Family conversations decreased. Fatigue showed in his expression. Working late again. When Carol asked, Mark just nodded vaguely. Their house was particularly well equipped with security and fire prevention systems, even in this quiet residential area. Carol had insisted on such equipment when they bought it 2 years ago. The mortgage was $300,000. With their combined household income of $120,000 from Mark's salary and Carol's daycare center earnings, the payments weren't easy. But there was a hidden problem no one knew about. Mark's secret $400,000 gambling debt. The weight of that casino-induced debt was increasingly cornering him. "I'm heading out." Seeing Katie off with those words, Carol headed to work too. The elderly were waiting for her at the daycare center. She had earned the staff's trust with her calm handling of emergencies and warm personality. Daily life appeared peaceful. However, beneath the surface, a storm that would greatly shake their lives was quietly approaching. At the daycare center one afternoon, Carol gazed at the family photo on her desk between paperwork. It was taken right after moving into their new home 2 years ago. Mark and Katie smiling, with her mother-in-law Helen standing beside them as if giving her blessing. Back then, she never imagined things would turn out like this. She remembered the day she first met Helen. Right after deciding to marry. A woman with an intellectual air befitting her background as a former high school teacher, elegantly dressed. Yet there was something calculating and cold in her eyes. That unsettling feeling she still couldn't forget. Still, out of love for Mark, Carol had suppressed that discomfort. A nurse colleague's voice brought her back to reality. Always calm and precise at work. That was an attitude she had consciously cultivated since that night 20 years ago. Returning home, she found an unfamiliar receipt on the living room table. From a luxury watch store. An amount that should have been beyond Mark's salary. Such disconcerting things had been piling up over the past few months. "Mama, welcome home." Katie's voice coming down from the second floor. Her daughter's presence always warmed her heart. Having lost her own mother, she was determined never to let Katie experience the same. That's why she was absolutely thorough about home safety. Escape ladders for every window. Multiple fire alarms. And an emergency bag positioned for quick access. "Katie, shall we do our evacuation drill today?" Yes. The weekly evacuation drill had become routine. Katie always took it seriously, as if understanding her mother's earnestness. Even though it was just practice, Carol's heart always tightened. Because the scene of her mother's death felt as vivid as if it happened yesterday. She never skipped her bedtime checks either. Confirming all windows were locked, security cameras working, fire hazards checked. The safe containing the life insurance policy was in its usual place. Insurance amount, $1 million. A precaution for the worst case. Ironically, it was the same thing that had driven her mother to her death. "Good night, Katie." Before leaving her daughter's room, Carol always looked back one more time. What she learned from her mother's death: never neglect being cautious to protect loved ones. That was her way of life. In the darkness, gazing out the window, Carol wondered. How long would these peaceful days continue? As if sensing the coming storm. The season was approaching early summer, and the days were getting longer. Still, by the time Carol returned home, the sun was already setting. Looking at the empty parking lot, she let out a small sigh. Mark's car wasn't back yet. This had become the new normal lately. His overtime, previously 3 times a week, was now daily. Weekend work increased, and his return time gradually shifted from 7 p.m. to midnight. Family conversations decreased, and he wouldn't let go of his smartphone even during meals. "Dad's scent is different," Katie had murmured one day. Carol had noticed too. The unfamiliar perfume lingering on Mark's collar. A luxury brand fragrance that should have been beyond his salary. Credit card statements showed charges from unfamiliar restaurants and high-end boutiques. Anxiety grew in Carol's chest. But even more concerning was the presence of her mother-in-law, Helen Blake, who had moved to the neighborhood 6 months ago. The 67-year-old former high school teacher, with her short white hair and ever-present expensive pearl necklace. Despite her superficial friendliness, her eyes held a calculating light. Her sudden frequent visits, excessive interference in household matters, and most notably, her knack for interrupting conversations between the couple at perfect moments. "Dear, leave it to me," Helen would say, standing in the kitchen. Carol felt uneasy watching her back. Her overprotective attitude toward her son seemed to suggest something beyond mere maternal affection. Then one afternoon, a call from the company's accounting department first brought the name Jessica Morrison to Carol's ears. 29 years old. A young female employee with a black bob cut, perfect makeup, wrapped in luxury brands. Around that time, Katie's behavior began to change too. She spent more time in her upstairs room, avoiding conversations with her father. Most worryingly, her asthma symptoms began worsening again. "Katie, what's wrong?" Even when asked, her daughter would just show an expression of wanting to say something, but ultimately remain silent. Later, it would become clear that she had been listening to her father's phone conversations through the ventilation duct in her room. And, worried about what she heard, she had begun recording them on her smartphone. Conversations with his mistress, discussions about money troubles, and talk about insurance. All of it recorded on Katie's small shoulders, weighted down with great anxiety. And that anxiety proved justified. One deep night, Carol was listening to her husband and mother-in-law's voices leaking from the study. The clock showed 1:30 a.m. "If we make it look like a fire, it's perfect. The insurance will definitely pay out." Her mother-in-law's cold voice cut through the darkness. "But is this really our only option?" Her husband's voice contained hesitation. "Once those two are gone, everything will work out." Those words sent a chill down Carol's spine. However, years of habit supported her. Carefully returning to her room without betraying her agitation. Final confirmation of escape routes. Contents of the emergency bag. And most importantly, checking Katie's room. Outside the window, the early summer night wind rustled through the trees. The sound seemed to echo like a prelude to an approaching tragedy. As night deepened, Carol's anxiety deepened too. After hearing the conversation from the study, she spent a sleepless night. Lying in bed, the nightmare from 20 years ago returned. Had her mother noticed then too? Did she have any premonition on that last night? While preparing breakfast, Carol observed her surroundings more carefully than usual. Mark had already left for work, leaving words about early morning site inspection. Katie's footsteps coming down the stairs brought her back to herself. "Good morning, Mama." The usual bright voice. However, her eyes held a shadow as if carrying something heavy. "Katie, is something worrying you?" she asked casually. But her daughter just shook her head. In her hand was the smartphone she had somehow begun carrying constantly. After breakfast, as Carol was clearing the dishes, the doorbell rang. "Good morning, Carol." Helen stood there, her pearl necklace reflecting the morning light. Another surprise visit from her mother-in-law, not uncommon lately. "I made Mark's lunch." Helen entering the kitchen. Her gestures revealed intentions to seize control of the household. "Helen, we can handle our own household chores." Carol responded calmly but firmly. For a moment, hostility flashed in Helen's eyes, but quickly returned to her usual friendly smile. That afternoon, while Carol was doing paperwork at the daycare center, she received a call from Mark's company. "This is Jessica from accounting." A refined voice. Even over the phone, her presence was striking. "Are you Mark's wife?" The conversation content was trivial. Confirming Mark's overtime application. However, there seemed to be something intentional in that voice. as if deliberately making her presence known. At dusk, returning home, Carol was greeted by Helen relaxing in the living room. "I was helping with Katie's homework." As if it were natural. However, there was no trace of homework on the table. At night, after putting Katie to bed, Carol rechecked all the house's locks. Then checked the emergency bag contents once more. Flashlight, first aid supplies, and most importantly, important documents. Everything was in order. Looking up at the window, the moon was hidden by clouds. And in that darkness, Carol strengthened her resolve. The past when she couldn't save her mother. But this time would be different. She would definitely protect her daughter's life, and her own. Between anxiety about tomorrow and strong determination, Carol spent a long night. At 5 a.m., the moment an unusual sound echoed from the kitchen, Carol woke up. A faint burning smell tensed her entire body. The memory from 20 years ago crashed over her in an instant. By the time she stood up, black smoke was already rising from the first floor. The fire alarm began its sharp sound. In that moment, years of training began moving her body. First to Katie's room. The emergency bag was already prepared near the door. "Katie, wake up." She gently but firmly shook her daughter's shoulder. Without giving time for confusion, she pressed a prepared wet towel to her daughter's mouth. "Mama. It's okay. We'll do just like we practiced." Desperately suppressing her trembling voice, Carol guided her daughter. Smoke had already begun filling the hallway. Setting up the escape ladder was a motion practiced countless times. Opening the window, confirming the fixings. The dark outside air flowed into the smoke-filled room. "Take it slow. Mama's supporting you." When Katie tried to exit through the window, Carol could tell an asthma attack was beginning. But having anticipated this, she quickly pulled out an inhaler. When the two reached the ground, lights in the neighborhood were turning on one after another. Someone's voice calling the fire department. Neighbors rushing out in pajamas. And there stood Mark and mother-in-law Helen. In proper clothes. As if they had been waiting. Their first expressions were clear shock and panic. Surprise at witnessing survivors outside their plan. But quickly, that changed to different expressions. "Carol. Thank goodness you're safe." There was something theatrical in her mother-in-law's voice. "It's okay, when the insurance pays out." Mark's words unnaturally trailed off. "You can come to my house." Helen quickly continued. In her eyes, light seemed to dance as if already planning the next step. With a roar, the fire truck arrived. The siren's light dyed the pre-dawn street red. Police vehicles also began gathering, starting preparations for scene investigation. Neighbors gathered with blankets and drinks. Among that circle of goodwill, Carol quietly strengthened her resolve. She would absolutely not go to her mother-in-law's house. However, that resolve couldn't hold long. In this situation, staying at your mother's house would be best. A police officer advised persuasively. Indeed, that judgment made sense. A mother-in-law extending help to a mother and child who lost everything in a midnight fire. To anyone watching, it seemed natural. Helen's house was just a few blocks from the fire scene. An old two-story white building. Outwardly orderly, but Carol felt something suffocating about it. Use the guest room upstairs. Carol felt uneasy about the room Helen showed them. A surveillance camera in the corner of the ceiling. For security, her mother-in-law said, but its position was clearly for monitoring the room. The first few days passed in confusion. Insurance investigators visited, beginning detailed investigation of the fire. The source appears to be the kitchen's electrical system. Carol narrowed her eyes at the investigators' words. She remembered checking all power sources last night. Police questioning also began. Was there anything unusual before or after the fire? Answering questions, Carol carefully chose her words. No evidence yet. But surely, something was wrong. Particularly concerning was Katie's condition. Usually active, she had become suddenly quiet since coming to her grandmother's house. Asthma attacks increased, coughing sounds heard at night. Don't worry. Grandma will take good care of you. Helen hovered around Katie with excessive attentiveness. Carol felt instinctive danger in that sight. At night, Mark frequently went out sighting work. Occasional whispered phone calls. Probably in contact with Jessica. Then, new reports from the insurance investigator. There are points we'd like to confirm about the life insurance contract. Carol's spine froze. Everything was connected. Her husband's debt, his mistress's existence, and the fire. Even this near imprisonment in this house might be part of the plan. Outside the window, the smell of fire still lingered. On the third night at her mother-in-law's house, while Carol spent another sleepless night in the upstairs guest room, she heard a small knock. Opening the door, Katie stood there. Tears glistened in her daughter's eyes. "Mama, I need to tell you something." A smartphone held out with trembling hands. Carol's heart began racing. "I've been recording Dad's phone calls." Katie's voice was hoarse. Her asthma symptoms clearly worsening from tension. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you." "Katie." Carol held her daughter tightly. The small body trembling. Pressing the play button. First came conversations between Mark and Jessica. The debt amount, talk of insurance money, and detailed fire plans. Then, meetings with her mother-in-law. Everything clearly recorded. "We need to take this to the police." No hesitation in Carol's voice. However, that decision also meant new danger. The next morning, sitting down for breakfast as usual, she noticed something different about Helen's manner. On the table, a newspaper article about difficulties in the fire insurance investigation. Her mother-in-law's eyes unnaturally fixed on the article. The insurance might not pay out. Carol casually mentioned. In that instant, Helen's expression froze. "Well, if that's the case, there are other ways." Her mother-in-law's words cut off mid-sentence. In her eyes was a coldness Carol had never seen before. That afternoon, Carol made her decision. Contact the police, inform them about Katie's recordings. At night, Katie's asthma suddenly worsened. Clearly different from usual attacks. The inhaler that should have been in the room was missing. Carol immediately noticed her daughter's change. Color rapidly draining, breathing more labored than usual attacks. "It's okay, I'll get your medicine right away. As Carol searched the drawers, Helen's voice echoed from downstairs. Oh, I put away the medicine. That voice contained an intentional coldness never heard before. Quickly, the medicine. Holding her struggling daughter's hand, something connected in Carol's mind. Her daughter's symptoms worsening since coming to her mother-in-law's house wasn't coincidental. This was planned. I'll go get it. Gently kissing Katie's forehead, Carol stood up. Remember to breathe deeply. Mama will be right back. Going downstairs, she found not only Helen in the living room, but Mark and Jessica too. On the table was Katie's inhaler. And several unfamiliar medicine bottles. Looking for this. Helen picked up the inhaler. Her gesture clearly provocative. What did you do? Carol's voice remained calm. The nightmare from 20 years ago gave her strength. A smart woman like you must have figured it out by now. Helen smiled wickedly. I just made a small adjustment to her medicine. This way it'll look like an accidental death. The insurance money will surely. What have you done? Mark suddenly shouted. Involving a child wasn't part of the deal. Shut up. Helen's voice rang sharply. Getting cold feet now. The $400,000 debt. Escaping with your young mistress. Everything went according to my plan. I've recorded everything. Carol pulled out her smartphone. The screen showed an active call with the police. You made a big mistake targeting my daughter's life. At that moment, the front door burst open with a loud bang. Tension shot through the room. As Mark tried to flee toward the entrance, police officers rushed in. Jessica screamed, dropping her expensive handbag. The contents scattered across the floor, forged documents, USB drives, and a familiar insurance policy. All evidence. This isn't right. Helen's voice trembled. The perfect plan crumbling before her eyes. What's wrong is your assumption. Carol's voice mixed strength with sadness. You thought I was foolish. But you forgot. I lost my mother. That experience protected me and Katie. Police officers gathered evidence one after another. Tampered asthma medication from the kitchen, insurance fraud evidence from the study. And surveillance camera footage. Everything came to light. Mom, why? Mark's voice was hollow. For you, everything was for you. Helen's facade finally crumbled. My son, drowning in debt, deceived by that woman. Ma'am. A police officer approached Carol. Let us check your daughter's condition. Paramedics are arriving. Carol rushed back upstairs. Katie was already breathing more easily, being tended to by a nurse. Mama. It's okay. We're safe now. Weeks later, the trial began. The evidence was perfect. Attempted insurance fraud. Attempted murder. And most seriously, harm to a child. The verdicts came down. Mark Blake, 15 years imprisonment. Jessica Morrison, accomplice, 10 years imprisonment. Helen Blake, considering her age, 5 years probation. Descending the courthouse steps, Carol looked up at the sky. The spring sunlight was warm. Mama. Katie held her hand. What will happen to us now? We'll start a new life in a new place. Carol smiled gently. Together, we can overcome any difficulty. 1 year later, in a suburban Minnesota neighborhood. A small but bright house with a garden. Carol stood at the entrance, talking with new colleagues from the daycare center. Hey Mama. Katie ran up, returning from school. In her hand, a perfect math test. Her asthma attacks had completely settled down. That's wonderful. Carol hugged her daughter. The past nightmare had become strength that fortified them both. Posted at the entrance was a poster for the Fire Survivors Group, started with community support. Carol used her experience to help others in similar situations. Mama. Katie whispered after finishing her homework. You know what? I've decided on my dream for the future. What kind of dream? I want to be someone who helps people in trouble, just like you. Carol smiled warmly. Outside the window, spring winds rustled new leaves. It seemed to be blessing the mother and daughter's new life. The trauma hadn't completely disappeared. But the strength gained from overcoming it now resided in their hearts as certain hope. The past can't be changed. But the future is different. Carol gently looked up at the sky.